So yes, I was going to mention, to start with, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure many of you will have looked at them. There are 17 of them. I'm actually an advisor to a company called Red Badger, which is actually in East London rather than West London, but it's a very innovative and extremely well-run IT consultancy firm. And before COVID, we were already looking at the UN SDGs and thinking about which ones we wanted to work on. And the idea was to create this thing called Mission Beyond, and to get business leaders, both in London and outside London, to join with us to try and promote those goals. And our view now is that COVID means that it's even more important to try and promote those goals and to try and remodel our economy to be better than it was before. And interestingly, the three goals that we had picked to work on before the pandemic for Mission Beyond were sustainable cities and communities, decent work and economic growth, and industry innovation and growth and infrastructure. And all of those obviously are even more important now, because we are being hurled into the most horrendous recession as a result of the pandemic. But there are some upsides, I think, potentially, which is that we do have a chance to try and rebalance our economy, to make it greener, to do something about the fact that there are all those people on 0 hours contracts working night and day for the minimum wage, to make sure that we return to economic growth, but we do so in a way that is more sustainable, that we think about our cities. I'm sure that all of us living in West London or working in West London have noticed how much cleaner the air is since the pandemic started, that we don't have to contend with aircraft noise continually, that we can walk along and actually breathe decent air, decent quality air. And over the last 40 years, there's been a constant increase in the number of children suffering from asthma in London. In fact, if I was the London mayor, I would get rid of all diesel and petrol vehicles in central London, and I would put in a tram system and just have electric cars, trams and bicycles. And it's great to see that people can actually cycle safely currently, but we're already seeing an increase in traffic as the lockdown eases, which is a shame in some ways. So looking at those goals, those three that we chose, I think, are still really important and have even greater significance as a result of the pandemic. So we need to think long and hard about how, as business leaders, we can actually influence a reshaping of Britain post the pandemic. Now, the other great issue of the day, of course, is Brexit. And we've gone from hearing about it continually, every news bulletin being entirely about Brexit, to now hardly ever hearing anything about it. And yet it remains a very key issue. And I think, if we were to leave with no deal with the EU at the 31st of December, that would be another very major blow to our economy. And obviously the government is going to have to try and construct some sort of deal. But I think what we're going to see, because there won't be any choice, is that, looking at the shape of our economy and how it's changed since the 1970s, financial services has obviously become a big part of it. And that is also a very big part of the London economy. And even if your business seemingly has nothing to do with financial services, the fact that financial services is such a big part of the London economy has an influence on everything. And we need to do everything we can to protect that industry and to make sure it still prospers. Now, although I am publicly and, have been for my whole life a European and have always fought hard, and particularly in the last election where I was a candidate trying to prevent Brexit, I do think that there are areas where financial services has suffered because of European legislation in the past, and there are going to be opportunities for us if we go forward with no real deal on financial services. And we've often read in the press about us becoming a pariah a pariah state 20 miles off the shores of Europe, a sort of, Singapore on steroids. I think that's probably what's going to happen, unfortunately. Unfortunately in some ways, but maybe in other ways it may be beneficial, because just in the last few days I've been trying to, in my fund management business, take on a fund, and I have to fill in about 500 forms for the FCA for this not very big fund that I'm sort of taking on as a sort of favour to somebody else. And all of that regulation has to do with the EU. So if we're not in the EU, I would think that will be swept away and it will be easier. Obviously, it's really important to still protect investors and make sure that there are all the protections that we need in place. But there is a heavy hand that's been placed on us, partly because of envy on the part of Germany and France that we're so good at financial services. So although I'm very, very pro-European, it may well be that there are things that will be positive as a result of Brexit for the financial services sector. And there will then be a trickle-down effect to lots of other businesses in London, which, might be not really particularly involved in financial services, but, because the wealth of London will be preserved if it continues to prosper, they will benefit too.
Maybe I should start off by talking a little bit about my organization and the SDGs, and then I'll make some comments about Brexit. So the NBI is a non-profit business association that functions in South Africa. We've been going, I was interested to hear that you started in '94, we did too, so we are just around 25 years old. We would have had a big celebration this year had it not been for the lockdown. And we were formed by at the request of President Mandela at that point in time, to try and find ways that business could support the new democracy, but also to find avenues through which business could play a responsible role in society. So essentially we work around sustainability issues, bridging its socioeconomic and environmental sustainability are really it's quite a broad sweep, and we're a fairly implementation-focused organization. We've run over the years big programs around energy efficiency in companies. We've done big schooling programs in South Africa. We've got a big climate, energy and water program at the moment. We do quite a lot of work around youth employability and looking at how certainly mainly the technical vocational education and training system can train in ways that are relevant to industry needs. We look at how it becomes easier for companies to take on young people. And we also do quite a lot of work to try and build government capacity, which is a huge problem in our country. And then pulling all of this together is a focus on the SDGs as well as our own national development plan. So what we do is to look at what do companies do, how does what they do support the national development plan, and through that, how are they actually supporting the SDGs. And so we've had an SDG program for a couple of years now, 3 or 4 years, starting off with quite a lot of work with companies to try and, I suppose, build awareness and understanding of what the SDGs are, and to try and get companies to think through how their existing social impact investment programs and the existing environmental programs talk to the indicators and the targets of the SDGs. And what we have in the last 2 years moved on to is to look at how we can bring different sectors of business together to be able to try and work out how those SDGs get incorporated into strategy at a sectoral level and then at the level of individual companies. And we've worked in depth at this point in time. Firstly, we worked with the banks, the big commercial banks, and looked at the relevance of the SDGs to the banking sector and got the banks to work collectively around a set of indicators that they felt they could all buy into, and that would allow them to look at, I suppose, a more systemic impact in relation to supporting the SDGs across the banking sector. And we are now working with the agro-processing sector in South Africa to do the same. And there we're looking at the entire value chain. So we have a range of participants in the work that go from the big agribusiness organizations, some of the small farming organizations, through to the food processors and some of the retail companies, all looking at the SDGs and agro-processing. So we've developed a methodology and to do this. And our next step in the process is going to be to try and find ways that we can make that accessible to business broadly. And it won't only be accessible to South African business. We'll try and make that it'll be available partly through our partners in the WBCSD, but also just through our own website. The kind of tools that we'll develop in the coming year will be up on the website and available for companies and individual companies or people working in groups to try and look at how they can apply that methodology to their own reality, and how they can start to align in a much, much tighter way what it is that they're trying to achieve in relation to core business, to an understanding that increasingly the demands on business need to also fulfill a set of socio-economic and environmental needs across society, and that the SDGs do provide a kind of framing and a tool to do that. So I think that's really how we've worked in South Africa across the SDGs. I think that we are probably, I mean, we're a small economy. We are a concentrated economy, and I think it's been in key economic sectors quite easy to pull together the key players in order to be able to do this work. And then I think that we do have a legal and regulatory framework that makes some quite significant demands of companies in relation to their involvement in society more broadly. That's not always a good thing, depending on what you're talking about, but it certainly does lay a base where all companies, I think in South Africa, it's very difficult to be a medium-sized or a large company and not think about what it is that you do in relation to your stakeholders and your community, look at where your employees are coming from and the issues that they are facing, given kind of this overall, I suppose, societal framing in relation to kind of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. So those issues are pressing and companies have to take them on. So we see this work as being quite important in order to be able to provide, I suppose, system and structure and allow companies to work together and collaborate in ways that are non-competitive. Okay, just a few comments about Brexit. I mean, it's very, I suppose Brexit has been a particularly bewildering thing to watch unfold from the other end of the world. I think that certainly as coming from a very small South African economy where kind of there are very few countries in the world you can go to as a South African without visas. There's certainly very little of a kind of free trade, free markets that we can participate in. I think understanding the complexities and the bureaucracy of the EU, it's always seemed to us, I think, and certainly to South African business, that the scale of the market that has been created by the EU over time and the freedom of movement that the EU has offered seems extremely attractive. So I think Brexit has been bewildering for us, and certainly the intricacies and the way that British politics has unfolded around it has been fascinating and confusing. But I think that more broadly and going into the future, certainly the British government, I think starting with Theresa May and continuing now, has been looking at how once out of the EU, the kind of Commonwealth, the former Commonwealth relationships and the relationships with the former colonies start to possibly offer opportunities for new markets. I'm not certain that one kind of particularly under the current kind of situation of a global recession and depression, that is going to come to fruition in any major way. And a lot of those countries themselves have fairly tiny markets and tiny opportunities. But in South Africa, Britain is one of South Africa's major, I think, the third trading partner. And they're very strong, obviously very strong relationships between the UK and South Africa. And there's been quite a strong push from the UK High Commission in South Africa to look at how those get elevated and get strengthened as, I suppose, a post-Brexit response. And that's run over onto things like work in the areas of work around water and climate and skills development, that the UK High Commission is increasingly starting to look at how it can support and invest in initiatives in South Africa. So, you know, South Africa may well benefit from Brexit, but I suppose Brexit has been confusing, and South Africa is a country that has a very strongly supports multilateralism and multilateral institutions. And I suppose in a world where there's an increasingly strong push in some quarters to bilateral rather than multilateral relationships, and a strong anti-globalization push, it's very antithetical to where we come from as a country. But I think that certainly from the private sector, there's a sense that there might be some quite big opportunities that might come out of it.